Welcome to this deep dive all about AIRMETs and SIGMETs, those weather advisories that pilots rely on to, make smart decisions up there in the air. Whether you're getting ready for a flight or just brushing up on your knowledge, or even if you're just curious about aviation weather, understanding these advisories is really key. So we've got some great pilot guides and articles here. So let's decode these advisories and see how they help keep us safe in the skies.
What's really cool about these advisories is they take all this complex weather data and they turn it into something that pilots can actually use. It's like having a meteorologist right there in your pocket, kind of whispering those key insights to help you navigate safely.
Okay, so let's start with AIRMETs. AIRMET stands for Airman's Meteorological Information. It's basically a heads up about less severe weather conditions that could still impact your flight, especially if you're in a smaller aircraft. So it's not necessarily a don't fly, but it's definitely a pay attention signal.
Exactly. Think of it as a yellow light. You might need to adjust your altitude or maybe tweak your route or even consider other landing options. But it doesn't always mean you have to cancel your flight.
And they have those kind of cool names based on the phonetic alphabet Sierra, Tango, and Zulu. What's the difference between these three types?
So each one focuses on a different set of conditions. AirMet Sierra, or S, is all about IFR conditions and something called mountain obscuration. Now, mountain obscuration might sound a little technical, but it basically means you've got low clouds and low visibility around mountains. So it makes it really difficult to see where you're going.
So that's why it's so important for pilots, especially in mountainous areas, to really understand AirMet Sierra. So what about AirMet Tango?
Well, AirMet Tango, or T, warns about moderate turbulence, those bumps that can spill your coffee,
Huh.
as well as strong surface winds and low-level wind shear. And low-level wind shear is super dangerous during takeoff and landing because it can cause sudden changes in wind speed and direction, making it hard to control the aircraft.
Sounds like you need a strong stomach and steady hands to deal with those conditions. And lastly, we have AirMet Zulu. What does that one cover?
AirMet Zulu, or Z, is all about icing and freezing levels. Icing can be a big problem because it disrupts airflow over the wings, which reduces lift and could even lead to a loss of control. So knowing where those freezing levels are is really crucial for avoiding icing.
I was reading about a pilot in the Pacific Northwest who said that, during the winter, it feels like AirMets are always in effect, and they've kind of learned to use that information to adjust their flight plan.
That's a perfect example of how airmets should be used. They're not meant to restrict you. They're there to inform you. They empower pilots to make those smart decisions based on the current weather.
So AirMets usually cover a pretty big area, right?
Yeah, they typically cover at least 3,000 square miles, and they're usually valid for about 6 hours. This time frame gives pilots enough time to, plan their flights while also understanding that weather can change quickly. Of course, airmets can be updated or extended if the conditions change.
Okay, so let's move on to SIGMETs. These sound a bit more serious.
They are. SIGMET stands for Significant Meteorological Information. And these advisories warn about severe weather that can be dangerous for any aircraft. We're talking about conditions that could make you really reconsider flying.
So what kind of weather falls under SIGMET?
We're talking about severe icing that can build up on your aircraft super quickly, extreme turbulence that can toss you around, dust storms that reduce visibility to almost nothing, and even volcanic ash, which, as you may remember from that incident with British Airways Flight 9, can be catastrophic.
That incident is a chilling reminder of just how powerful and dangerous volcanic ash can be. I remember reading that those tiny ash particles can actually melt inside the engine, which causes it to clog up and fail.
Yeah, it's like throwing sand into a finely tuned machine. Now, to break down segments a bit further, there are two main categories, non-convective and convective. Non-convective SIGMETs, or WS, are issued for those hazards we just talked about, the icing, turbulence, dust storms, and volcanic ash.
Okay, and what about convective SIGMETs? What makes them different?
Convective SIGMETs, or WST, are all about severe thunderstorms. These are the ones that pack a punch. They bring high winds, hail, tornadoes, embedded thunderstorms, which are basically thunderstorms hiding within larger cloud systems, lines of thunderstorms, and that dangerous low-level wind shear we were talking about earlier.
So if I see a convective SIGMET on my weather map, it means I should be prepared for a potentially rough ride. What's the typical validity period for a SIGMET?
Non-convective SIGMETs can last for up to 4 hours, but convective SIGMETs, because thunderstorms can change so quickly, they're usually valid for up to 2 hours. Just like AIRMETs, they can be updated or extended as the weather develops.
So SIGMETs are basically the red light of aviation weather. Often they lead to flight cancellations or big delays, but I imagine there can be exceptions, right?
Yeah, there can be times when a pilot might choose to fly through a SIGMET, but it really requires a super careful assessment of the specific conditions and risks involved. One source we looked at mentioned a case study where a pilot, after meticulously planning and coordinating with air traffic control, was able to successfully navigate through a convective SIGMET.
Wow, that's incredible. It just goes to show that while these advisories are super important for safety, they're ultimately just tools to help you make decisions. And there's always a human element involved.
Yeah, it's this really interesting combination of science, technology, and human judgment.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about airmets, we've talked about sigmets, but how do they actually, compare in terms of how serious they are and their impact on what a pilot decides to do?
Well, it's all about understanding the level of risk.
Hmm.
You can think of airmets as like a cautionary thing. They're highlighting conditions that could be tricky, especially for smaller aircraft. Or maybe less experienced pilots. SIGMETs, on the other hand, are like, whoa, really watch out. They're telling you about severe weather that could affect any aircraft.
Okay, so airmets are like, hey, pay attention, and sigmets are like, whoa, this is serious.
Exactly. And to help pilots really visualize how serious it is, a lot of flight planning apps use color coding.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
Yeah, active SIGMETs, the ones that are like right now an immediate threat, they show up in red on those maps. It's hard to miss. Outlook SIGMETs, which are like potential hazards further out, they might be in yellow. More of a keep an eye on this.
That visual cue is really helpful,
It is.
especially when you're looking at a map with so much information on it. It's like having a built-in warning system. But, something I've noticed is that even if an area looks clear on the map, checking that wind direction can be so important to see how those storms might be moving. Because what might be safe now, could become dangerous if a storm's headed your way.
You've got it. Weather is always changing, so you can't just rely on how it is right now. You got to think about how it's going to change over time and where those storms are heading.
Right.
So speaking of getting this information, where do pilots actually find these advisories?
Well, the Aviation Weather Center website is the main place to go. They've got all the latest advisories and forecasts and a ton of other weather data.
And then there are also some really great pilot tools.
Sure.
Apps like ForeFlight, Felt Plan, and SkyVector. They take all that information and present it in a format that's really easy to understand. They even overlay it right on the map, which is super helpful.
It's amazing how technology has made it so much easier for pilots to get all this weather information. It's like having a personalized weather briefing right there on your phone or tablet.
It really is. And, I always recommend checking multiple sources. Different tools might focus on different things, or their data might be updated at different times. So having that well-rounded perspective is really important for making good decisions.
That makes sense. So you've got the airmets and sigmets on your map. What's next? How do you actually figure out what they mean?
Well, the good news is that they're mainly designed to be used visually. You look at the map and see where those hazardous areas are in relation to where you're planning on flying.
So it's less about trying to decode a bunch of text and more about just seeing the big picture.
Exactly. Of course, SIGMETs do have a specific format with abbreviations and codes that tell you about the specific hazard,
Hmm.
like if it's severe turbulence or icing. But the most important thing is to see where those hazards are located on the map.
Gotcha. And I imagine it's also important to look at other weather layers on the map as well, right? Like the radar, flight category, pilot reports, visibility, ceilings. All of that can give you a more detailed idea of what's actually going on inside those airmet or SIGMET areas.
Absolutely, you're right. All those additional layers give you more context. One of the sources we looked at actually mentions this case where there was an AirMet Sierra for IFR conditions, and everyone thought it was going to be really bad. But after they checked the visibility and ceiling reports, it turned out that those really low conditions were only happening in a small part of the area covered by the AirMet.
Wow, that's interesting. So it really highlights the importance of not just relying on one single source of information. You have to put it all together to get the best understanding of the weather.
Exactly.
So let's bring this home for our listener. Imagine you're a pilot, you're cruising along, and all of a sudden, bam, you hit severe turbulence. The kind that makes your stomach do flips.
Yeah, that would definitely get your attention.
I can only imagine it sounds terrifying, but what if I told you that you could have known about that turbulence ahead of time, just by looking at the SIGMET before you took off?
That's the point of these advisories. They can literally mean the difference between a nice smooth flight and one that's really rough and potentially dangerous.
It's not just about knowing the technical stuff. It's about having peace of mind knowing that you've done everything you can to stay safe.
That's a great way to put it. It's about empowering pilots with the knowledge they need to make those smart decisions.
Exactly. It's pretty amazing how AIRMETs and SIGMETs take this complex weather data and make it something pilots can actually use.
It really is a perfect example of how science and technology can come together to, improve safety. Think about it. We're taking these powerful forces of nature and turning them into information that can help keep pilots safe.
Yeah, and for anyone listening who might not be a pilot, I think this deep dive has really shown how much is going on up there in terms of weather. It's not just sunshine and clouds, it's a whole other world.
It really is. And, as we learn more about climate change, it makes you wonder how that might affect things like airmets and sigmets.
Yeah, that's a good point. Could we see more of these advisories in the future? Or maybe even more extreme weather that requires even more caution?
That's a really interesting question. And it's something that, pilots and meteorologists and everyone involved in aviation is going to have to keep thinking about.
Absolutely. Well, a huge thank you to you for walking us through all of this. It's been really eye-opening.
My pleasure. It's always fun to talk about aviation weather.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've learned something new and that you'll keep exploring the world of aviation weather.
Remember, informed pilots are safe pilots. So keep learning, stay curious, and enjoy those skies.
Fly safe, everyone. Tay.